It began with a desperate knock and a man who couldn't look away. In a sun-scorched field where humanity was long forgotten, a pregnant woman stood with no name, no hope, until a quiet stranger stepped forward and gave her both. What followed wasn't just rescue, it was redemption, rebirth, and the kind of miracle you never expect, but never forget. If stories of love, courage, and second chances speak to your heart, consider subscribing. Every story here is a light left on just in case you're searching for one. Now let's begin. The sun over western Montana was unforgiving that day, a scorched eye in a cloudless sky, glaring down on a barren field that hadn't seen rain in weeks. Dust clung to the air like smoke, and the cracked earth underfoot seemed to groan under the weight of the silence. A circle had formed, drawn not by chalk, but by shame men and women who wouldn't admit out loud what they were there for. No signs, no names, no law, just a gathering of buyers and sellers, and the things they sold weren't livestock or machinery. Today it was a woman. She stood barefoot in the center, her arms wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. Her name was Evelyn. 7 months pregnant, sunburned cheeks, blonde hair matted to her neck. She didn't cry. That part of her had dried up weeks ago like everything else in this wasteland. Next to her stood a man broad-shouldered, bearded with sunken eyes, and the grin of someone who'd long since sold his soul. His name was Troy Lasker, and today he was selling his wife. "Gentlemen," Troy said, raising a half-crushed water bottle like a toast. "She's a hard worker. Doesn't talk back. She's got another one coming, so that's 2 for the price of 1. No one spoke. A bead of sweat slid down Evelyn's spine. "Hell, I'll even throw in her wedding ring," Troy added with a bark of laughter, yanking it off her finger and holding it in the air like a cheap trinket. Someone coughed. Another man shifted his boots in the dirt, but no one raised a hand. No one stepped forward. Even among the morally bankrupt, there were lines too far to cross. A pregnant woman. That was bad business. Too much baggage. Too much risk. Troy scowled. "What nobody interested? You all afraid of a little responsibility? Come on, it's hot out here. Let's not drag this on." And then from the outer rim of the circle, a quiet voice answered. "I'll take her." Heads turned. The crowd parted slowly, revealing a man with sun-weathered skin, shaggy dark hair under a frayed trucker hat, and a lean frame wrapped in a faded flannel shirt. His name was Silas Hart, though most in town only knew him as the mechanic in the hills, a widower. The man with the mute son, a ghost really until now. He stepped forward, pulling a canvas pouch from inside his coat. The way he walked, slow but certain, made it clear he hadn't come here to negotiate. He set the pouch on the edge of the platform. It made a soft clink when it landed. Not bills, but coins. Everything he had. Troy blinked. "You kidding me? That's all you're offering?" Tilas met his gaze calmly. "It's everything I've got, and it's more than she deserves to stand here 1 more minute." A ripple passed through the crowd, a murmur of discomfort, maybe even shame. Troy's mouth opened to protest, but Evelyn had already stepped down from the platform. She looked at Silas, her chest rising and falling with each breath, as if the air had suddenly turned heavier. Why, she asked, voice hoarse. He didn't reach for her, didn't touch her, just nodded once. Because no one should be sold. Not you. Not the child. Her bottom lip quivered, but she held it together. Troy let out a scoff and kicked the pouch toward Silas. "Fine. Take her. Trash belongs with trash." Evelyn flinched, but Silas didn't react. He picked up the pouch, turned, and started walking. Evelyn followed him step by tentative step, into the heat, into the silence, and into a future neither of them could name. As they walked away, someone in the crowd called out, "You're gonna regret that, Hart." He didn't look back, and for the first time in months, neither did she. Later that evening, the sun had dipped low by the time they reached the truck parked at the edge of the pine woods. Silas opened the passenger door and helped Evelyn in gently. She winced from exhaustion, but didn't complain. Inside the truck, the silence returned. Not the uncomfortable silence from the field, but something deeper, quieter, like grief with a heartbeat. Silas glanced at her as he turned the key. "I don't expect thanks," he said. Evelyn stared ahead. "Then we're even. I don't know if I have any left to give." He nodded. They drove for nearly an hour without words, the tires crunching gravel wind, hissing through the cracked window. Finally, he spoke again. "I live up in the hills. It's not much, but there's food, water, a roof. I won't be a burden," she said quickly. "I can work. I've worked all my life." Silas shook his head. "It's not about that. You're not something to earn your keep. You're just safe now." Evelyn closed her eyes and leaned her head against the glass. The child kicked gently beneath her ribs, as if sensing the shift, the end of fear, and the beginning of something else. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe the soil where hope could grow. The cabin sat alone at the edge of Elk Ridge, tucked into the shade of towering fir trees, and embraced by the quiet hum of wind against pine. There was no fence, no welcome mat, no porch. Light, just weathered wood, a sagging tin roof, and the faint smell of cedar smoke drifting from the chimney. Silas pulled the truck up the gravel drive, the headlights washing over the front steps. He didn't speak. He rarely did, unless there was something worth saying. Evelyn, still cradling her belly with both arms, hadn't asked where they were going. She hadn't asked anything at all. As the truck stopped, the door of the cabin creaked open. A small boy stood just inside the threshold, barefoot, pale, dressed in an oversized shirt that reached his knees. His hair was dark and uncombed, and his large brown eyes were wide with both curiosity and apprehension. This was Finn Hart, Silas's son, 8 years old, diagnosed with severe social anxiety and selective mutism after his mother's sudden passing 3 years earlier. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to anyone since. Silas stepped out of the truck, walked around to open Evelyn's door, and offered his hand. She hesitated, not because she didn't trust him, but because everything felt so fragile, like if she moved too quickly, it would all collapse into dust. But she took his hand, and Finn watched from the shadows, not moving, not blinking, as this stranger stepped over the threshold into what had once been only their quiet, grieving world. The inside of the cabin was dim but tidy. The living room was small, with a stone hearth in one corner and a stack of firewood neatly arranged nearby. The kitchen was little more than a sink, a stove, and a table with 2 chairs. A hand-sewn quilt draped across the back of a rocking chair. The smell of pine cleaner and something faintly sweet lingered in the air. Evelyn stood uncertainly in the doorway. "I can sleep on the floor," she said, almost automatically. "I don't need much." Silas shook his head. "The couch folds out. Sheets are clean. You'll be more comfortable there." She nodded slowly, but her hand didn't move from her belly. Silas noticed. "I'll boil some water," he said, already moving toward the stove. "Tea's in the cabinet if you want it." Finn still stood in the doorway. His eyes flicked to his father, then to the woman, then back again. Evelyn turned toward him, offering the gentlest smile she could manage. She'd once worked with children, taught music to entire classrooms. But this was different. This was a child who carried silence like a wound. "You must be Finn," she said softly. He didn't answer. He didn't even nod. But he didn't run either. That was something. Later, after the tea had cooled, and Evelyn had managed to nibble on a piece of toast, she sat on the edge of the pull-out bed, brushing her fingers across the faded floral sheet. She wasn't sure when she'd last felt clean linen or warmth that wasn't a byproduct of fear. Silas handed her a pillow. Bathrooms down the hall. Hot water takes a while. Thank you, she murmured. He paused, standing awkwardly at the edge of the room, as if unsure what else to offer. Then in a voice even quieter than hers, he said, "You're safe here, Evelyn. I don't know what comes next, but you can stay as long as you need." She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Why are you doing this?" He hesitated. Then, because someone should have done it for my wife. But no one did. She didn't push, and he didn't explain more. That was enough for one night. Finn sat on the floor outside the door, his small back pressed against the wall. He'd listened to everything. Not the words, but the tone, the rhythm, the pauses. Children like him, they learned to listen to what people didn't say. And he had never heard his father's voice sound like that. Weary, yes, but open, vulnerable. And the woman Evelyn, she had spoken softly without trying to make him answer, without filling the silence like adults always did when they were uncomfortable. Maybe she was different. Evelyn didn't sleep much. The baby was restless, turning and shifting inside her, like it too was trying to figure out where they were. She lay on her side hand, resting on the curve of her stomach, watching shadows dance along the ceiling from the wood stove's last flickers. There had been a moment, just one, back at that awful place under the sun, where she thought it was over. That no one would step up. That the last shred of her dignity would be sold off for the price of a tank of gas. And then he had. Silas Hart. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like he hadn't smiled in years. Like he carried his pain in the quiet corners of the house, in the dusty tools on the porch, in the old photograph of a smiling woman Evelyn had glimpsed on the fireplace mantel. But he had saved her anyway. And perhaps he had saved himself too, though he didn't know it yet. At dawn, Evelyn woke to the sound of water boiling. She sat up slowly, stretching stiff muscles, and walked toward the kitchen. Finn was already there, sitting at the table still in his sleep shirt, drawing on a small whiteboard with a dry erase marker. When he noticed her, he didn't hide the board. He turned it around and showed her. A simple drawing. 3 figures. A tall one, a small one, and one with a round belly. Below them a cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. Evelyn looked up, eyes stinging with sudden tears. "Is that us?" she whispered. Finn didn't speak, but he nodded. Once. And it was enough. The morning light in Elk Ridge wasn't loud. It arrived gently like a friend who knocks, but never forces the door open. It filtered through the pines and pooled softly on the windowsill, where Evelyn sat with a chipped ceramic mug in her hands, watching steam rise like slow-moving ghosts. She hadn't spoken yet. She was listening. From the back of the house came the faint creak of floorboards, Silas pacing the hallway, as he always did before the day officially began. And then, more delicately, the light shuffle of small feet. Finn. He appeared in the doorway, still clutching his whiteboard, the marker cap clenched tightly between his lips like a cigarette. His eyes flicked to Evelyn, then away, unsure. But he didn't retreat. "Morning, sweetheart," she said gently. He froze. Her voice wasn't sugary, wasn't exaggerated, just warm, familiar, like the morning sun itself. Slowly, he wrote something on the board and turned it toward her. "You don't talk like the others." Her lips parted slightly, not in surprise, in recognition. She nodded, placing her mug on the table. "That's because I used to talk to children every day. I was a music teacher." Finn's head tilted. "You taught songs he wrote." "I did," she said, smiling softly. "Hundreds of them. From Twinkle, Twinkle to Beethoven's Ninth." He erased, then wrote again. "Do you still sing?" Her hand fell instinctively to her belly. "I haven't. Not in a while. but I suppose it's like riding a bike. She rose carefully from the chair and moved to the cabinet beside the fireplace. Silas had mentioned once that his late wife kept an old harmonica in the drawer there. She found it beneath a tea towel dulled with age, but intact. Finn watched his eyes narrowing with interest. He didn't blink as she wiped it clean with the hem of her dress and brought it to her lips. The first notes wavered, not from lack of skill, but from disuse. But within moments, a melody emerged, simple, soft, and achingly familiar. It was the kind of tune that echoed down long hallways in small-town schools, the kind that made children pause at windows and teachers hum under their breath while grading papers. Finn's fingers curled around the edges of his whiteboard. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just listened. And from the hallway, Silas stopped moving too. By mid-morning, Evelyn had cleared and cleaned the table. She moved with ease now, not because her body was stronger, but because something inside her had shifted. Purpose had returned like blood flow to a numbed limb. Silas entered the kitchen with an old toolbox in hand, clearly on his way to work on the generator out back. He nodded toward the harmonica on the table. "Haven't heard that tune in a long time," he said. She glanced up. I figured it was time the house heard music again. Silas hesitated. Finn liked it. He hasn't sat still like that in weeks. Evelyn's voice softened. He's not afraid of quiet. That's something we have in common. He studied her a moment longer, then gave a small nod and stepped out the back door. Evelyn watched him go, the screen slamming gently behind him. There was pain in that man, not just the pain of loss, but of guilt. The kind that builds walls and convinces you you're safer in your own sorrow. She recognized it because she carried her own version of it. Later that afternoon, as the clouds began to gather in lazy spirals above the trees, Finn brought the whiteboard to her again. "What's the baby's name?" he asked. She paused, placing her hand on her belly, feeling a soft flutter beneath her palm. "I don't know yet." Finn frowned, thinking. He scribbled, "I think she likes your song." Evelyn chuckled. She did kick pretty hard during the chorus. He erased again, then slowly printed a single word in large, careful letters. "Hope." Evelyn froze. The marker squeaked in his hand, but he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was watching the baby bump. Waiting. "Hope," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name." Finn shrugged as if to pretend it didn't matter, but his ears turned red. Evelyn reached over and touched his hand, just the edge of his fingers. "I think she'll love that name too." It was the first time Finn didn't pull away. That evening, Silas returned from the woods with grease on his hands and a branch cut on his arm. Evelyn met him at the door with a damp towel. "You always forget gloves?" she asked, dabbing at the scratch. "Only when I'm fixing things that shouldn't still be running." "You mean like this whole place?" He cracked a tired smile. "Something like that." She hesitated, then said quietly. Finn named the baby. That gave him pause. He spoke. Not out loud, but he wrote it. Hope. Silas leaned back against the wall, nodding slowly. "That's a good name." Evelyn folded the towel and set it on the table. "Do you mind?" Silas looked at her, looked at her for the first time that day. "I think," he said slowly, "we could all use a little more of it." That night after dinner, Finn sat on the rug with an old wooden puzzle. Evelyn rocked in the chair, humming the same melody from earlier, fingers brushing her stomach. Silas sipped coffee by the hearth, eyes drifting between them. Something inside him, a place long closed off, stirred. Not loudly. Not with fireworks or grand declarations. But in that quiet room, with warmth on the walls and music in the air, something long frozen had begun at last to thaw. The first snow of the season came earlier than expected. It dusted the treetops like powdered sugar settling into the grooves of the mountain path with a quiet finality. Silas had mentioned the cold would come, but even he hadn't expected it so soon. By the time Evelyn opened the cabin door that morning, the ground was already white, the sky pale and endless above her. She stepped onto the porch, pulling Silas's flannel around her shoulders, one he'd draped over a chair the night before. It still carried his scent, cedar engine oil, and something quieter like worn pages of a book left open too long. In the snow, something caught her eye. A box, small, wrapped in brown paper tied with twine sitting squarely at the bottom step. No footsteps in the snow. No tire tracks. Just the package resting like it had been placed there by the wind. She looked around, but there was no one in sight. The forest stood still, blanketed in silence. Inside, she set the box on the table and carefully untied the twine. Finn came in behind her, rubbing sleep from his eyes, still barefoot on the cold floor, like he couldn't quite feel the chill. He paused when he saw the package. "What's that?" she asked aloud, though mostly to herself. Finn sat at the table and pulled his whiteboard close. "Mailman doesn't come here," he wrote. Evelyn nodded slowly. She opened the box. Inside, a soft wool blanket perfectly folded. Beneath it, a box of prenatal vitamins, a tin of cocoa, a packet of herbal tea, and a small bottle of lavender lotion. At the bottom, tucked inside a manila envelope, was a single piece of thick parchment paper. There was no return address, no card, just a note handwritten in elegant, looping script. "You are not forgotten. You are not alone. Keep walking toward the light." Evelyn stared at it. She read it again, then once more. Finn leaned over and read it too. His brow furrowed. He tapped his board. "Who's M?" She didn't answer right away. She ran her fingers over the words, letting the ink settle into her chest like warmth against winter. "I don't know," she whispered. But they see us. When Silas returned that evening from clearing brush along the south road, he noticed the blanket immediately draped over the back of the couch, where Evelyn was crocheting, her legs curled under her, like she belonged there. He raised an eyebrow. Knew she nodded. "There was a package this morning." His eyes narrowed slightly. "No footprints?" he asked. "None." He walked to the table, lifted the note she'd left beside the cocoa tin and read it. His jaw tightened. Could be someone playing games. It didn't feel like a game. "You sure?" Evelyn stood, slowly walked over and handed him the bottle of prenatal vitamins. "You think someone trying to hurt us would give us this?" Silas looked at it then, at her. "No," he said quietly. "I don't." That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay on the pull-out bed, the fire casting shadows on the ceiling, and stared at the folded note on the table. There was something about the handwriting, graceful, deliberate, that reminded her of another life. A life with warm desks and piano recitals, with students bringing her daisies from roadside ditches. There had been kindness in that world, before Troy, before bruises hidden by long sleeves, before court orders ignored and promises shattered. Now somehow, in the middle of nowhere, kindness had found her again. In the days that followed, more packages came. One with dried mango and almonds, one with handmade baby socks, and a jar of calendula cream. Always wrapped the same. Always with a note short and poetic, signed only with an M. Silas tried to follow the trail once got up before dawn and circled the entire property in the truck. Found nothing but rabbit prints and pine needles. "Either they've got wings," he muttered, "or they're smarter than both of us combined." Evelyn didn't press him. She just folded each note and placed it carefully into an empty recipe tin in the kitchen drawer, like prayer she didn't know how to say out loud. One evening after dinner, Finn sat beside her on the couch with his whiteboard. He wrote slowly, carefully with his tongue, poking slightly from the corner of his mouth. He turned it to her. "Do you think Em is watching us?" She considered the question for a moment, then smiled. "I think they're seeing us." Finn wrote again. "I like being seen." She ruffled his hair, and for once he didn't flinch. Silas watched them from the doorway. He hadn't said it out loud, but he knew what was changing. The house had been a tomb for years, filled with absence, with echoes of the life he'd lost. But now it hummed again. With music, with laughter, with the smell of tea and rosemary, and the sound of a boy scribbling his thoughts in silence and handing them to someone who read them like treasure. And then there was Evelyn. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. But her presence, it softened the edges of things. He caught her humming earlier, swaying slightly as she stirred a pot of soup. It wasn't a melody he knew, but it was one he wanted to learn. As the fire burned low and the snow thickened outside, Evelyn returned to the couch and opened the tin where she kept the notes. She added the latest, "The world is dark. Yes, but there are stars, and some shine brighter when you need them most." She closed the lid gently, as if it contained more than just paper. And perhaps it did, because somehow, in this forgotten corner of the world, she no longer felt forgotten. The days grew shorter. Dusk began arriving like an old friend who didn't knock anymore, just let itself in. The snow, once soft and symbolic, now pressed hard on the roof and windows. Evelyn had begun to walk slower, holding her back more often. The baby hope, as Finn insisted, was growing strong, stronger than Evelyn imagined anything inside her could be. On that particular morning, the cabin was unusually quiet. Silas had left early to help a neighbor pull a fallen tree off a fence line. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of milk, watching the snow dance sideways through the window. The fire crackled lazily behind her. Finn sat cross-legged on the floor, nearby, working silently on a puzzle he'd done a dozen times, but still seemed to find comfort in. Every now and then, he looked up at her, not to say anything, but just to check that she was still there. She had become his marker of safety. Suddenly, a sharp movement in her belly made Evelyn gasp and nearly drop the mug. Finn's head snapped up. Evelyn laughed, not out of amusement, but shock. Her hand flew to her belly fingers, splaying like she was trying to catch the movement from the outside. "Oh my goodness," she whispered half to herself. That was a kick. Finn scrambled up whiteboard forgotten. He hovered in front of her like he wasn't sure what to do. "Here," Evelyn said gently, reaching out and taking his small hand. She placed it over the curve of her belly and waited. For a moment, nothing. Then another kick. Finn's eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He looked up at her, with a face caught somewhere between awe and fear, like he'd just witnessed something sacred and didn't know if he was allowed to feel it. "She's saying hello," Evelyn said softly. "She knows you're here." Finn nodded, then darted for his board. When he turned it around, it read, "I think she likes me." Evelyn laughed, wiping a tear from her cheek. "She's already lucky to have you." That afternoon, Finn stayed close to her. He helped chop vegetables awkwardly but determined. He laid the table, his small hands placing forks perfectly aligned. When Silas returned covered in snow and sweat, he found the house warm, not just from the fire, but from the mood. Finn met him at the door, and without writing a word, simply grabbed his father's glove-wrapped hand and tugged him inside. He kicked. Finn wrote on the board after Silas had sat down and removed his coat. "She," Silas asked. Finn nodded with conviction. "She," Evelyn confirmed. "And strong, too." Silas smiled, but it was quieter than theirs, a smile that flickered at the edges of a guarded man's heart. "I guess it's official then," he said. "She's part of the household." That night, Evelyn sat in the rocking chair by the fire blanket over her knees, the harmonica resting beside her on the side table. She was humming again, not the melody from before, but something new. Something wordless and intimate. It filled the cabin like breath. Finn sat on the floor with a fresh notebook Evelyn had found in one of the care packages. He wasn't drawing or writing, just flipping through the blank pages listening. Silas, sitting across from Evelyn, spoke quietly over the firelight. "You really plan to name her Hope?" Evelyn paused the rocking chair, gently creaking. "If she makes it." "Yes, she will." The words came faster than he meant them to, but they hung in the air with certainty. Evelyn smiled, not at his confidence, but at the fact that he'd offered it at all. "Hope," he repeated. "Fitting." She kicked for the first time today, Silas. Not just fluttered. Kicked. Like she was ready. He nodded his gaze on the flames. "Sounds like someone else I know." She tilted her head. "You," he chuckled dryly. "Not me. Finn." She glanced toward the boy who had now fallen asleep on the rug, his head resting on the notebook like a pillow. "Yeah," she whispered. "He's braver than most adults I've known." Silas leaned forward, rubbing his hands together. "I didn't think he'd take to you. He doesn't with people. Not since, well, you know." Evelyn didn't press. She'd learned when silence mattered more than questions. "I didn't think I'd take to people again either," she said after a moment. He looked up at her, something flickering in his eyes. "I guess we're all doing things we didn't plan on." Later that night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The baby was active, and her mind wouldn't settle. She rose quietly, wrapped herself in a shawl, and stepped out onto the porch. The snow had stopped. The moon cast a gentle glow across the clearing, turning the white world into silver. Steam curled from her tea. All was still. She remembered what the nurse had said months ago before Troy had dragged her out of the clinic mid-appointment. Strong babies move early. They're fighters. She hadn't had a reason to believe that then. She did now. The door creaked behind her. Silas stood in the threshold, arms crossed for warmth eyes, not surprised to find her awake. "She's moving again?" he asked. Evelyn nodded, smiling. "Like she's trying to kick her way into the world early." He leaned against the post beside her. Wouldn't blame her. World might be hard, but at least this place, it's starting to feel like something. She looked at him. "Like home?" He hesitated, then gave a soft nod. "Yeah," he said. "Something like that." The knock came just before sunset. 3 sharp raps on the cabin door. No car sounds. No footsteps in the snow. Just that knock, dry and certain, like it knew exactly what it was doing. Evelyn froze mid-stir at the stove. Her hand gripped the wooden spoon so tightly her knuckles turned white. The baby shifted inside her suddenly still, as if she too sensed something wrong. Silas was in the shed, working on a broken snowblower. Finn was drawing at the table, his feet swinging gently beneath the chair. The knock came again, this time slower. Evelyn wiped her hands on a towel and walked to the door, pulse hammering in her ears. She unlocked it, cracked it open, and there he was. Troy. Same scruffy beard, same dead eyes, same crooked smile that used to crawl across her skin like oil. "Evening, sweetheart," he drawled like this was a Sunday visit, like he'd never tried to sell her to the highest bidder in a field full of strangers. Evelyn stepped out quickly, pulling the door halfway shut behind her, blocking his view of Finn inside. "You need to leave," she said, voice low, sharp, with steel she hadn't used in years. Troy laughed, short and mirthless. "That any way to greet your husband? You lost that title the day you put a price tag on me." He looked her up and down, eyes lingering on her stomach. "Looks like you've been getting comfy." She didn't flinch. "This isn't a place for you," His smile thinned. You think some backwoods mechanic can give you what you need? What that baby needs? From behind her, Finn appeared, silently peeking out. Troy's eyes flicked to him. Well now, who's the kid Evelyn blocked his line of sight again? He's not your concern. Does Silas know you're keeping company with another man's wife? The words stung, even though they shouldn't have. Legally, he wasn't her husband anymore. Spiritually, he never was. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Troy, she said, her voice steady. And I won't let you near this child. His eyes darkened. You think I can't take back what's mine? And then, before Evelyn could answer, a new voice cut through the air behind her. You need to leave. Now. Silas. He stood a few feet away, his jacket half-zipped, oil-stained gloves still on his hands. His eyes, normally quiet and weary, burned now, not with rage, but with clarity, a kind of finality. Troy turned. Well, well. The knight in flannel. Silas didn't blink. This isn't a threat, it's a warning. Troy took a step forward. You gonna stop me? I don't have to, Silas said. But I'm not the only one watching. He jerked his head toward the tree line. Troy looked, and for the first time seemed uncertain. Far off in the woods, a flashlight flickered. Then another. Movement. Silas had called a few neighbors after the first package had shown up, told them to keep an eye out. Not because he expected trouble, but because he knew trouble always found a way back. You try anything Silas said, and you won't get out of these woods. Troy stared at him for a long moment. Then he spat into the snow and took a step back. This ain't over. No, Silas said, his voice low and certain. It is. And then Troy was gone, swallowed by the trees, his boots crunching angrily through the crusted snow. Back inside, Evelyn dropped into the kitchen chair, trembling. Finn stood beside her, hand on her shoulder. She whispered, I didn't think he'd come back. Silas poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove. They always do, he said softly. But so do we. Stronger. He knelt in front of her, resting a calloused hand over hers. You okay, Evelyn? Looked at him. Really looked, and for the first time let herself believe the truth in his voice. I think I will be. That night, Evelyn sat on the porch wrapped in a quilt. The baby was restless again, and so was her heart. She didn't cry. There was something steadier in her, now not the absence of fear, but the arrival of courage. Silas joined her, 2 steaming mugs in hand. He's gone, he said quietly. For now. He handed her the mug and sat beside her. I meant what I said. He doesn't come back here. Ever. She nodded. Then, after a moment, she said, You didn't have to step in like that, but you did. Silas looked down at his hands. I've made mistakes. I wasn't there the way I should have been before. For your wife, she asked gently. He nodded once. I thought I had more time. She was sick, but I thought if I worked more, if I fixed things, I could outrun it. I was wrong. I missed the moments that mattered. Evelyn reached over her fingers, brushing his. You didn't miss this one. He looked at her, and the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they hadn't yet found words for. Inside, Finn was asleep on the couch, the blanket with the stitched name, Hope, tucked around him. The house didn't feel like just walls anymore. It felt like the beginning of something harder, but deeper. A kind of rebuilding that starts in the bones and works its way out. In the quiet of the night, Evelyn rested her hand on her belly and whispered, You're safe, little one, and you're going to be born in a house that chose kindness. The storm moved in fast, not with the quiet patience of drifting snow, but with the reckless fury of winter reclaiming what had been too still for too long. It began as a low wind curling through the treetops, bending the pines, like they were whispering warnings to one another. By nightfall, it became a howl. Snow pelted the cabin windows in sideways sheets. The fire inside roared in protest as drafts crept under the door. Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink, both hands pressed against the counter, her breathing shallow. The first sharp pain had hit 2 hours ago. The second followed 20 minutes later. Now they were barely 10 apart. She didn't want to say it out loud. Didn't want to worry Finn curled up with his notebook by the fire. Didn't want to distract Silas, who was out in the shed securing the roof. Didn't want to admit to herself that this baby Hope had chosen tonight of all nights to arrive. Another wave of pain gripped her harder this time. She dropped the dishcloth, braced herself against the table, and let out a low groan. Finn's head snapped up. "Evelyn," he asked, voice as small as a candle flame. She turned toward him with a practiced smile, trying to mask the tremor in her knees. "It's okay, sweetheart. She's just eager." Finn stood, notebook still clutched in one hand, and ran to the door. He yanked it open into a wall of wind and snow and yelled into the night. "Dad!" Silas burst through the door minutes later, his coat soaked snow clinging to his beard and boots. One look at Evelyn, pale, breathless, bracing against the table, and he understood. "How far apart?" he asked. 8 minutes. "Maybe 7, she said, then winced again. He nodded, his movements quick, but calm. "Finn, go bring every clean towel we've got. Then grab the first aid kit under the sink." Finn bolted into action without a word. Evelyn looked up at Silas, her voice shaking. "There's no hospital for 30 miles. "I know. And the road's buried already." "I know," he repeated. He cupped her elbow, helped her slowly toward the pull-out bed in the living room, the only place warm enough and close enough to the fire. "I don't want to do this alone," she whispered. "You're not," he said simply. The next hour blurred into contractions, wet towels boiling water, and Evelyn's knuckles turning white from gripping the bed frame. Silas worked silently, sleeves rolled up, doing what he could, saying what needed to be said. "You're doing good, Evelyn. You're stronger than you think." She wanted to believe him, but fear crawled through her ribs. Not of the pain, she could handle pain, but of losing this baby, of losing herself. And then something happened. A voice. Soft, from across the room. "I'm here." Evelyn turned her head, sweat clinging to her temples. "Finn." He was kneeling beside the bed, holding her hand. His notebook abandoned. He had spoken. 2 words, his first in months. "I'm here." Evelyn broke, not from pain, but from something greater, something deeper. She squeezed his hand and sobbed, not from fear anymore, but from a flood of something long-buried belief. At 2:11 a.m., under a roof battered by wind and beside a fire nearly burned down to coals, Hope Hart entered the world, red-faced, loud-lunged, alive. Silas wrapped her in a towel, his hands gentler than they had ever been with anything mechanical. He passed her to Evelyn, who held the baby against her chest, weeping into her hair. "I've got you," she whispered. "I've got you now." Finn climbed onto the bed beside her and laid his head carefully against her shoulder, just above the baby. Silas sat back on his heels, chest heaving, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for hours. For the first time since his wife died, he felt the world shift. Not backward, not toward grief, but forward toward something he couldn't name yet. Later, when the storm had quieted to nothing but soft flakes drifting past the windows, Evelyn lay resting with Hope asleep in her arms. Silas sat nearby, rubbing warmth into his fingers and staring into the embers. "She's got lungs," he said softly. Evelyn smiled, eyes closed. "She's got fire." They sat in silence a long while. Then she spoke, her voice low and full of things unspoken. "You saved us." He shook his head. You saved me." She opened her eyes. "Before you came," he said slowly. "I was just passing time. I got up, I worked, I kept my son alive. But I wasn't living." He looked at her now, at the woman who had walked into his broken life and rebuilt something out of nothing. "I didn't know how much I'd lost until you reminded me of what was possible again." Evelyn reached for his hand. "You gave me a place to be more than someone's victim. You gave me a home to bring her into." They sat that way, fingers linked, both of them quietly marveling at the weight and wonder of new life. That morning, just as the sky began to lighten with hints of blue beyond the tree line, there was a soft knock on the door. Silas tensed. He opened it carefully, but there was no one. Only a small basket wrapped in red flannel. Inside, a baby blanket hand-stitched, a bundle of fresh oranges, and a card. In the same elegant handwriting as before, "A storm always clears. And what survives it becomes something stronger." "Welcome, little hope." Silas looked out into the forest, but again no tracks, just silence and peace. He brought the basket inside and set it on the table. Evelyn opened her eyes. She saw the card, saw the flannel, and smiled. "Still watching," she said. "Always," Silas replied. And somewhere deep within the walls of that little cabin in Elk Ridge, where a storm had once howled and hearts had once broken, something had changed forever. A baby had been born, a family had been made, and hope, true enduring hope, had found a way to stay. The storm had passed, but it left behind more than fallen branches and icy paths. It left a sense of stillness, as if the mountain itself had paused to witness the birth that had happened inside that small wooden cabin. A life had entered the world when nature raged its fiercest, and somehow everything had held. Evelyn lay in bed with hope bundled against her chest, the baby's tiny mouth opening and closing in quiet dreams. Her cheeks still glowed pink from the firelight, and her breathing had found a new rhythm, no longer strained, but calm, resting, belonging. Finn hovered nearby, drawing careful pictures in his notebook. The baby's first cry, her little hand, the fireplace, the storm. Silas moved through the cabin with a soft heaviness. His every gesture was quieter now, as if the house had been changed by what had happened, as if it deserved reverence. But outside, the world hadn't forgotten how to doubt. Word had spread faster than Silas expected. 2 days after the storm broke, the mail truck arrived, not with letters, but with whispers. That Evelyn had been living there, that she had given birth, that she had brought trouble. By late afternoon, the cabin had visitors. It began with Mr. Crowley, the feed store owner from down in town, standing awkwardly on the porch, hat in hand, not sure whether to knock or walk away. Silas opened the door before he could decide. Crowley shifted from foot to foot. Heard some things he muttered. "Just thought I'd come see." Silas said nothing, waiting. Crowley coughed. "They're saying you took in a woman who was sold, that she's got a baby now, that she's not your wife." Silas's eyes narrowed, but his voice was calm. "All that's true." The old man blinked. "You don't deny it." "Why would I?" "You want to know what else is true." Crowley blinked. "She's brave. She saved my boy's voice, and she brought a little girl into this world when most men would have left her to suffer. And not once has she asked for more than a warm place to stand." The older man looked down, thumb running along the rim of his hat. "People are talking, Silas, saying it ain't right." Silas leaned against the frame of the door. "Let them talk. I'd rather be standing beside someone the world throws away than beside the world that does the throwing." There was a pause. Then Crowley nodded, turned to leave, and hesitated. "I brought diapers," he said quietly, handing over a small plastic bag. "My granddaughter dropped them off this morning. Told me to bring them here. Silas took the bag and nodded. Thank you. By the third day, there were more. A woman from the post office left a basket of fresh bread. The carpenter's wife brought hand-me-downs from her twins. An old woman from the church, who'd never spoken more than a greeting, dropped off a knit cap with Hope's name stitched on it, as if she had known it all along. Some came with kindness, others came with questions. A few came with judgment. One came with fire. It was just after dusk when the knock came again. This time it was hard. Quick. Silas opened the door to find a man he didn't know. Burly, red-faced, smelling of gasoline and stale beer. You Silas Hart? The man demanded. I am. That girl you're keeping in there, she's trouble. You know it. Everyone knows it. You bringing her back. Here, letting her nest that's gonna cost you. Silas folded his arms. You've said your piece. Now leave. But the man didn't move. You think folks like her can change? They don't change. She's someone else's mess. Don't make it yours. Silas stepped forward. You're standing on my porch, talking about a woman who gave birth during a blizzard and never once asked for pity. I suggest you think real hard about who the mess is in this conversation. The man glared. You'll regret this. Then I'll regret it on my feet, not on my knees. The man spat, turned and stomped off into the dark. 10 minutes later, smoke curled up from the front fence post. Silas was outside before the flames reached the railing, beating it down with a wet blanket. It hadn't spread far, a warning, not a true attempt to burn the house. But a warning nonetheless. When he turned back toward the cabin, Evelyn stood in the doorway. She didn't cry. She didn't ask if he was okay. She just said, I won't be the reason this place burns. Silas stared at her, breathing hard. You're not the reason. You're the reason it's alive. That night, they sat together, all three, in silence. Evelyn held Hope. Finn sat close beside her, and Silas nursed a cup of black coffee, staring into the fire. The cabin walls felt different now. Not tighter, not threatened, but braver. Evelyn looked at him over the rim of the baby blanket. Why do they hate so easily? Silas's voice was low. Because it's easier than understanding. And easier still than admitting they might have walked away when they should have helped. She nodded slowly. We can't stay hidden forever. I know, but we can't leave either. Silas looked at her, really looked. You're not going anywhere. A long pause. Then Evelyn smiled, not because everything was okay, but because someone had finally said she could stay. Just stay. The next morning, a group of neighbors gathered near the cabin, 5 or 6 of them standing around a camp stove someone had wheeled in on a sled. No torches, no signs, just coffee and silence, and the presence of those who were ready to stop pretending neutrality was kindness. When Silas opened the door, one of the women, a tall rancher with gray braids and leather gloves, handed him a box of canned goods. She looked him in the eye and said simply, We stand with the baby. Silas smiled. Then come on in. The snow melted slowly that spring, like it was reluctant to let go of what had been buried beneath it. But the thaw came, as it always did, with quiet insistence. Ice turned to rivulets. Dead branches gave way to tiny buds. The mountain shed its white armor, revealing brown soil and tentative green shoots. Inside the cabin, life had already begun to bloom. Hope was nearly 3 months old. She had her mother's chin, her father's nose, or so Evelyn would sometimes joke, and Finn's eyes, not in color, but in depth. The way she looked at the world, as if she already knew it could be both cruel and beautiful. She rarely cried. When she did, it wasn't the shriek of panic Silas had prepared for, but a softer wail, like she was simply reminding them she was still here, watching, listening. And Finn, once so silent the house seemed to echo with it, had found his voice again. Not all the time, not in crowded spaces or around strangers, but at home in the gentle hush of evening or the first golden light of morning. He spoke, quietly, deliberately, like someone who had learned to value each word like a coin from a rare mint. It started with reading. Evelyn would sit on the couch with Hope nestled in the crook of one arm and a picture book in the other. Finn would sit beside her, first listening, then mouthing the words, then reading them aloud. The day he read an entire page on his own. Silas had to leave the room, not because he wasn't proud, but because something in his chest had clenched so tightly he could hardly breathe. That night, Silas stood on the porch, hands deep in his pockets, staring up at the stars. Evelyn came out beside him, swaying slightly from rocking Hope to sleep. He read aloud, she said softly. I heard Silas murmured. She looked at him. You okay? He nodded, eyes glistening. It's just... I didn't know if I'd ever hear it again. Evelyn placed a hand gently on his arm. You gave him more than your name. You gave him silence that didn't judge. And now he's choosing to fill it. Silas swallowed hard. That's your doing, Evelyn. She smiled. No, it's love's doing. We just made room for it. Later that week, the local school teacher, Ms. Delaney, stopped by the cabin with an invitation. A small spring talent gathering. Informal. Meant to bring the community together after a winter that had been harder than most. We're asking kids to read or sing or share something, she explained. Only if they want to. Finn doesn't have to. Evelyn thanked her, promising nothing. When Finn read the invitation later that evening, he looked up, uncertainty flickering in his face. You don't have to, Silas said immediately. But Evelyn gently touched Finn's shoulder. Only if you want to. He looked down at the paper again. Can Hope come? He asked. It was still startling when he spoke so rare, so precious, that Silas and Evelyn both paused before nodding. She wouldn't miss it, Evelyn said with a smile. The evening of the event arrived like a breeze through an open door. The town hall was lit with strings of white lights and smelled faintly of cinnamon and old pine floors. Finn sat near the front knees, bouncing under his seat, notebook clutched to his chest. Hope rested peacefully in Evelyn's arms, wearing a tiny floral bonnet gifted by one of the neighbors. The room buzzed with the sound of folding chairs and quiet laughter. When Finn's name was called, he hesitated only a second before rising. He walked slowly to the front, each step, deliberate, a hush falling over the crowd, as he stood beside the microphone. He opened his notebook and began to read. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was steady. Clear. This is a story about a house in the woods, a house that was quiet, a house that hurt. Then a woman came with a baby in her belly, and she brought singing, and soup, and a name. The baby was born during a storm. Her name is Hope. This is a story about my family. It is not broken. It is ours. When he finished, no one clapped right away. They couldn't, because most of them were crying. Back home, Finn crawled into bed, without needing a reminder. Hope was already asleep in her crib. Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink, drying the last of the dishes. Silas sat at the table staring at the lamp, still hearing his son's voice in the air. When Evelyn turned around, she saw it. The way Silas's shoulders had softened, the way his face had let go of years all at once. You okay? She asked. He nodded, then shook his head. I keep thinking this isn't real. Evelyn approached slowly. What part? He looked at her. All of it. That he spoke. That he stood there like that. That he said, ours. She pulled out a chair and sat beside him. You didn't rescue us, Silas, she said gently. You just made space. You let something grow that had no business surviving out here. That kind of love. It doesn't look dramatic. It looks like this. He turned to her, emotion pulling at the edges of his voice. I've spent so long being afraid I'd fail him again. You didn't, she whispered. You gave him what no one else could. You stayed. A long silence passed, the kind that only feels quiet because nothing more needs to be said. Then Silas reached out, and for the first time, not by accident or necessity, he took Evelyn's hand. It was rough and warm and steady. And when she didn't let go, something in both of them finally settled. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees, bending the branches in a kind of reverence. Inside, the cabin glowed softly, not from the fire, not from the lamp, but from something far more enduring. The voice that had returned, and the love that had stayed. The summer sun climbed slow and golden over Elk Ridge, casting a warm haze on the gravel drive that curved toward the cabin. Wildflowers bloomed on either side of the road, purple lupine, yellow yarrow, orange columbine. The mountains, once cloaked in frost, now stood proudly green under the morning light. Inside the cabin, Hope babbled in her crib, while Finn carefully spread jam on toast with surgical focus. Evelyn stood at the sink, hair tied in a loose braid, humming as she washed dishes, and Silas was fixing a loose hinge on the screen door. Everything was ordinary, until it wasn't. Finn was the first to hear it, the sound of tires on gravel. Slow, steady, heavy. He darted to the window and pressed his nose to the glass, his eyebrows lifted high. A car, he said. A big one. Silas stepped onto the porch, squinting into the sun. Coming up the road, gleaming like a polished memory, was a midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantom, not the kind of vehicle that belonged to the hills or the muddy switchbacks of Elk Ridge. It belonged to old money legacy Silence bought by Power. Evelyn stepped beside him, drying her hands on a dish towel. That's not local, she whispered. Silas shook his head. Definitely not. The car rolled to a stop just before the porch. The engine cut. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened with a soft click. Out stepped a woman. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in a tailored linen coat the color of fresh cream. Her heels crunched softly against the gravel, though everything about her presence said she was not a woman accustomed to crunching anything. She carried no handbag, just a slim envelope in one hand and a pair of driving gloves in the other. Silas Hart. She asked, her voice rich, and even like a cello in an empty church. He stepped forward slowly. Yes, ma'am. And you must be Evelyn. Evelyn nodded cautiously, heart pounding. The woman's expression softened. Then I believe I've come to the right place. They invited her in, of course. You don't leave a woman like that standing on your porch, no matter how confused you are. She moved through the house, like someone remembering an old song, pausing at the fireplace mantel, at Finn's stack of notebooks, at the wooden crib beside the sofa. When Hope let out a tiny squeal from her blanket nest, the woman turned toward the sound, as if she'd been waiting to hear it all her life. She's beautiful, she said. Evelyn smiled nervously. She's everything. The woman looked at Silas, then back at Evelyn. I suppose I owe you both an explanation. Silas sat slowly. You're M. It wasn't a question. The woman nodded. My name is Margot Hale. I run a foundation out of Boston. Quietly. No website, no press. Just a network of eyes and ears across the country. We help women escape situations most people don't even believe exist. She placed the envelope on the table but didn't slide it across. 3 months ago, one of our people sent me word about a woman being auctioned off like livestock. The tip was vague, no names, no location. Just a photo. A man handing over a canvas pouch. A woman too pregnant to stand straight. Evelyn's hand went to her mouth. That man Margot said, nodding toward Silas, stood out. Not just because he gave away everything he had, but because he didn't look at her like she was a burden. He looked at her like she was worth it. Silas said nothing. Margot smiled gently. So, we watched. From a distance. We made sure supplies showed up. Just enough to keep you afloat, never enough to frighten you. We never interfere. But we never abandon. Finn was watching her. Now, eyes wide. Margot turned to him and said with surprising warmth, "You were the first to make contact, you know, when you drew that picture and left it in the blanket we sent." My assistant wept when she saw it. Finn blushed and looked down. Silas finally spoke. "Why come now?" After all this time, Margot's expression turned serious. "Because I don't just invest in rescue, I invest in rebirth. And I believe something rare is happening here." She tapped the envelope. Inside is a grant, non-taxable, untraceable. Enough to build what you need. Expand. Shelter more people. Or not. You don't have to take it. You don't owe me anything. Evelyn stared at her. Y.S. Margot looked at her for a long moment. "Because you made something beautiful from something brutal. And you didn't do it with money. You did it with kindness. With listening. With staying. Most people run when things get hard. You stayed." Her eyes moved to Silas. "And you, Mr. Hart, taught your son the most important thing a man can learn, how to speak without raising his voice." Silas cleared his throat. "I never planned for any of this." "No one ever does," Margot said softly. "But maybe that's how we know it's real." An hour later, after tea, and photographs of Hope and a promise from Finn to send more drawings, Margot stood at the door, her coat buttoned, once again, gloves in hand. Evelyn hesitated. "Will we see you again?" Margot smiled. "You won't need to." Then, after a pause, she said, "But I hope you will." She turned to Silas. "Keep the light on, Mr. Hart. There are more out there than you know." He nodded. "We will." Margot stepped off the porch, her heels clicking once more on the gravel, and disappeared behind the door of the Rolls-Royce. The car rumbled to life, then slipped back down the path, quiet as snowfall. That evening, Evelyn found Silas sitting on the porch, envelope unopened in his hands. He didn't say anything when she sat beside him. They watched the sky shift from gold to navy, the moon rising slowly above the ridge. Finally, Evelyn asked, "Are you going to open it?" "Maybe tomorrow," he said. She rested her head on his shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "some miracles come in plain wrapping." He smiled. And inside behind them, Hope stirred gently in her crib, while Finn sat at the table carefully drawing a new page for his notebook. At the top, he wrote, "Today, someone who helped us became real. But kindness that was always real." A year passed. Not in fanfare or firecrackers, but in moments, ordinary, miraculous moments. Hope learned to sit, then crawl, then walk with a bounce that defied gravity. Finn grew taller, more confident, his voice slowly becoming part of the house, like it had always been meant to live there. Evelyn laughed again, not just the careful laugh of someone healing, but the full-bodied joy of someone who had found her place and wasn't afraid to claim it. And Silas, he began to live, not just in the routine of survival, but in the sacred rhythm of presence. He planted wildflowers around the cabin, taught Finn how to repair a radio, and built a rocking chair with his own hands. Not because they needed it, but because he finally understood that some things are worth making just to hold what you love. One afternoon in early summer, Evelyn stood barefoot on the porch, Hope in her arms, watching the clouds drift above Elk Ridge like old stories retold. The porch had become their heart. It was where meals were eaten on warm evenings, where Hope took her first steps, where Finn sat and read aloud, while Evelyn stitched small things for the local women who'd begun to visit more and more, often not for help, but for company. Silas stepped out with 2 mugs, offering one to her. He kissed Hope on the head, and leaned against the post beside her, his eyes scanning the sky. "She's growing fast," he said. "She's starting to say real words now." "She was born ready," he said, with a quiet smile. They watched as Hope pointed at the trees and shouted, "Bee!" It didn't matter that there wasn't a bee in sight. What mattered was the joy in her voice, the way it echoed off the cabin walls like a hymn. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the family gathered for dinner on the porch. Finn had baked cornbread. With Evelyn, it was slightly lopsided, but full of pride. Hope gnawed on hers, while Silas sliced vegetables from the garden they'd planted that spring. Everything about the moment felt earned. That was the thing no one tells you about peace. It doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives like this, in small hands reaching for yours, in the way someone breathes beside you, without fear in knowing you chose each other again that morning, and will do it again tomorrow. After dinner, Silas lit the porch lantern. Its warm glow spilled across the steps, illuminating the wildflowers now dancing in the wind. It was the same lantern he'd left cold for years, untouched. But now it came on every evening like clockwork, not just for them, but for whoever might need a little light in the dark. As twilight settled, Evelyn rested her head on Silas's shoulder. Hope slept in her lap, a soft weight. Finn sat cross-legged nearby, sketching another picture in the worn notebook he never went anywhere without. He held it up. It showed the porch, the rocking chair, Hope asleep in Evelyn's arms, Silas beside them, Finn at their feet, and above in the night sky, a scattering of stars. At the top he had written, "This is our porch. It used to be dark. Now it is full of light." Evelyn reached for his hand. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Silas looked at Finn. "You're gonna write books someday." Finn grinned. "I think I already did." They laughed quietly, not the kind of laughter that shouts or tries too hard, the kind that only comes when hearts have been broken and healed in the same place. As night deepened, a breeze picked up, carrying the scent of pine and something sweeter lilacs from the bush Silas had planted just outside Hope's window. Suddenly, Evelyn reached into her apron and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I've been saving this," she said. Found it tucked in Hope's first onesie. I think it was from Margot. She unfolded it, slowly smoothing the creases. In that same elegant, looping handwriting, a house is built with wood and nails. A home is built with time and tenderness. You've made a home. Keep your porch light on. Someone else is still looking for the way. They sat in silence after that, letting it settle, letting it become part of the night. The next morning, the porch light was still on, not because anyone forgot, but because you never know who might be walking a lonely road, hoping for a glow to guide them. 1 year later, the porch had changed. It now had 2 rocking chairs, not 1, a second flower bed, a set of painted handprints along the railing. Finn's idea. He insisted Hope add hers too, even if she just smeared purple paint across the wood. The mailbox had grown busy. Letters arrived weekly, some from neighbors, some from strangers. All carried the same story. "I heard about what you did. I thought maybe there was no place for someone like me. Now I believe maybe there is." They kept every letter, folded gently, and stored in the same tin where Evelyn once kept Margot's anonymous notes. It now sat beside a label written in Finn's bold hand, "Miracles Daily." One final letter came that autumn, a short note written in the same familiar script. "You once needed a miracle. Now you are one. Don't forget that." Evelyn read it aloud, then placed it in the tin with the others. She looked up at Silas, who was bouncing Hope on his hip, while Finn read aloud from a new book. "Do you think we really are?" she asked. Silas tilted his head. "Are what miracles?" He didn't answer right away. He looked around the porch, at the family they'd become, at the home they'd built out of firewood forgiveness, and the decision to stay. Then he smiled the kind of smile that knew how much it had cost to get here, and how worth it had been. "Yes," he said. "We are, and sometimes the quietest acts of kindness become the loudest miracles of our lives." If this story touched your heart in any way, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments and help us build a community that spans not just stories, but miles. If you'd like more stories like this, stories that remind us of the goodness still left in the world, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, just a light left on in case you ever want to come back. Thank you truly for spending part of your day with us. We're so glad you're here,